Hello, I'm Des Birkinshaw,
No, I'm Mark Hooper.
and this is Without the Beatles. What should we call it? Are we allowed to give it a superlative yet, or should we just say the podcast?
I think we'll let the
Other
audience
people.
decide.
Fill in the blank, blankety blank.
Don't know what you're going to say then.
Yeah, I have no idea either. This is called improvisation. It's not that great. So this week's episode, the last full interview of this year, there's not the final episode of this year, is with Steve Van Zandt. I've met him a few times, and he's such a laugh. So he's exactly what you want Steve Van Zandt to be.
And like, two careers, it's amazing to, sort of had this whole acting career as well as being in one of the most important bands of the sort of 70s and beyond.
Well, it's three careers because he was also a producer and also a DJ and everything. So he's had several, and I think he talks about that. But Steve Van Zandt, of course, you do know him as one of the founding members of the E Street Band, Bruce Springsteen's childhood friend, and they form a band. Have a guess why they formed a band? What was the? Have a guess what the jumping off point there is. We'll let Steve tell you in a second. And of course, played Silvio in The Sopranos, the greatest TV series. Second,
let's put it top that or Breaking Bad, I'd say, but
top five. Let's go top five.
Yeah.
Definitely top five. And he's actually incredibly like Silvio to me, actually. But let's talk about that afterwards. So, Steve Van Zandt, part one.
Enjoy.
So, hi, Steve. It's great to meet you again. I have to ask everyone this question, of course, because it's the name of the program. But could you imagine a world without the Beatles? And if not, why not?
Well, it's a horrifying thought, of course. Particularly for me, they introduced the idea of a band, really, which was what got me interested. I wasn't really interested in the single singers or the doo-wop stuff. I mean, I kind of missed the 50s, other than my grandmother dancing around the house to Elvis Presley. I wasn't particularly interested. So suddenly, there's this thing where four good-looking guys, very interesting-looking guys, different, who sang well and played well, and pretty much from the moment we met them, wrote well. This was new and quite striking to me as important, because what that was communicating was not show business exactly. It was friendship and brotherhood and community. I didn't know that at the time, but that was what I got some other feeling from them, and it would turn out to be those things that, to this day, are what sort of motivates me. So that was the first, Without the Beatles. There was lots of good stuff going on musically. The Beach Boys and Four Seasons had sort of carried on the vocal group thing, but weren't exactly bands in the same sort of way. The Motown thing, of course, was happening and would have continued to happen. So there would have been some good music. But the band thing, which turned into the British invasion thing, the Beatles would be quickly followed by, Dave Clark 5 and Rolling Stones and the Animals and Yardbirds and Who and Hollies and Herman's Hermits and all those great groups. That would, in fact, I think, cause Bob Dylan to go electric, which is probably the second biggest impact that may not have happened without the Beatles. Who knows? But I think it was a very important factor for Bob making that decision. So then the third big impact that may not have happened would be Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones in particular, all influencing each other, causing a new art form to take place, to be born, called the art form of rock, which essentially started in 1965.
Yeah.
With Bob's Like a Rolling Stone, and the Byrds, really, Mr. Tambourine Man before that, making pop radio safe for someone as eccentric and not particularly commercial as Bob Dylan's voice, but the Byrds paved the way by having a hit with his song, Mr. Tambourine Man, that summer of 65. He would follow with Like a Rolling Stone, and the Stones, with Satisfaction, and the Beatles with Help that year. And suddenly something different was happening, Mm-hmm. The very personal and important lyrics that were confined usually to folk music or blues suddenly found their way in pop music. That may not have taken place. I guess the next big impact, one could say, and it was sort of a up and down sort of impact, would be on the legends and pioneers of rock music. They were already in disarray when the Beatles hit. Buddy Holly and Richie Valens died in a plane crash. Eddie Cochran had died in a car crash. Chuck Berry was in jail for transporting an underage girl across state lines. Jerry Lee Lewis had been blackballed for marrying his 13-year-old cousin. Elvis was in the army. Little Richard found the fear of God when Russia launched Sputnik and quit, became a preacher. But, they were already, let's just say, in and out of the business, but the Beatles would, at first, temporarily, drive the final nail in their coffin of their careers. And the Beatles would put a lot of their own heroes out of work, ironically.
Yeah.
It has a happy ending because the evolution of these pioneers, when they began, they were not pioneers. They were circus freaks, serving as a distraction for this new odd group of people called teenagers, which never had existed before. Well, these few awkward years became an industry, and they were there to, the pioneers were there to sort of help define that culture. And it was only when the British invasion and Bob Dylan created this new art form that these circus freaks became pioneers of that art form and the legends that we know them to be today.
If that was the only thing that they were responsible for, that would be quite a lot of things. But there was obviously also these other things going on at the same time, like, the Byrds, but I've talked about some of the other people, but the Byrds seeing the Rickenbacker in Hard Day's Night, changing instruments, changing the instrumentation of music, making that two guitars and bass and drums. There was a lot of cross-fertilization.
Consequently, yes, the Byrds would invent folk rock.
For sure. And of course, the Byrds themselves go on to become one of the most influential bands, and they influence folk rock. Obviously, they invent it, really. But then you've got things like alt country later on, which are obviously derived from that too.
Oh, no doubt. No, the musical trends are literally everything pretty much started with them. I mean, beginning with, their most obvious early impact was I don't think the Rolling Stones would have been a success without them. The first single, Chuck Berry's Come On, one of their few not very good records, failed. And they were in trouble already when Andrew Oldham, their manager, who had worked for the Beatles, ran into John and Paul on the street and brought John and Paul back to rehearsal, and they finished I Want to Be Your Man for them and gave it to them. And because the Beatles were so big already, I believe that the radio at that point had to play the Stones. And that's the only reason they played them. That's if you listen to that record now, it's quite ferocious. It is ferocious by any standard. Brian Jones' tone of the bottleneck guitar part is extraordinarily distorted and very cool. And very unlike pop radio.
Well, that's right. In the UK, where we have shows that play, all the hits from a certain week in 1963 or something. And what happens is you hear these like lame records. There's like, normal pop record, more normal pop radio. And then the Beatles will come on and it's incredibly aggressive. The Stones come on, it's incredibly aggressive. The Kinks come on. I think the Beatles, particularly, somehow, above all the others, seem to have the best access to equipment. So their stuff still sounds great now, right? The Kinks sound like they're recording on sellotape, but
yeah,
it's quite magic, really.
No, it was quite a miracle. Considering the producer was comedy guy, you know. George Martin went from literally recording, Peter Sellers to making amazing records. I mean, immediately. I mean, Love Me Do, George Martin himself tends to put down. I just find it to be the most brilliant record. I mean, I've never heard any record like it before it or since.
Yeah, no, people don't say that much.
Just an amazing.
Yeah, just it's not skiffle.
The sound of it, and obviously the writing of it, and the odd harmony and all that. It's just the mood of it. The mood of it is just so odd, and brilliant, really.
Well, sorry, Steve. The other thing is, they were an electric act, right, in the clubs, and they do their first single. They're in the studio. You think they want to go in all guns blazing, but it's actually acoustic, isn't it?
Oh, right through.
Yeah, it's acoustic all the way through. Why didn't they go in with Twist and Shout? It's really strange. I've always found that a really surprising choice for the first single.
Well, they maintain that, and it's a very important point, actually. The acoustic guitar, which, of course, in England came from the whole skiffle thing, really what played an extraordinarily important role throughout, certainly through the first 5 records, first 5 albums. You can almost always hear it. I'm trying to think of where you don't hear it. I mean, it was used more often than not. So that was always important, and an interesting connection always between the folk world and the country world to some extent, and the rock world, was maintained and defined by the Beatles' use of that acoustic guitar.
Yeah.
Very important all the way. It's an important role in Help. I can hear it right now.
Well, most of Rubber Soul.
Right through.
Yesterday.
Really all the way through. All the way through.
Yeah, and a lot of the times they amplified the acoustics as well, so Jeff Emerick or whatever could get a different electric guitar sound. So where were you in during all of this? Were you an Ed Sullivan boy?
Yes, I am.
So what are your memories of this pivotal moment?
One of the 71 million. It was the equivalent of literally a flying saucer landing in Hyde Park. Imagine the effect that would have. Well, this was a bigger effect than that. Okay. Literally, the world changed that day, February 9th, 1964. There were no bands February 8th. Everyone had a band February 10th. Most of them didn't get out of the garage. Literally, overnight, everybody's hair suddenly looked very short. Everybody's clothes looked very boring. Everybody needed to have a band. And suddenly, every single accordion player in America, and there were quite a few, became keyboard players and found a farfisa.
Yeah.
And we're ahead of the game because of that.
The Vox Continental, wasn't he?
Early childhood schooling.
Yeah.
I immediately, I had gotten a little bit of a jump because my grandfather had been teaching me folk songs from his village in Calabria. But, I was just sort of doing it to hang out with him, But after Ed Sullivan, I was concentrating a bit more. Took a few lessons, and he said I think my second or third lesson, he said I have natural talent.
Yeah.
So
Well, he was granddad, he had to say that.
What do I need you for? And I really knew he was not going to teach me the solo that George Harrison was playing, the role of Beethoven.
Well, it's a tricky one, isn't it?
Which I still have trouble with.
Yeah, me too.
But it was a revelation. One of the first real epiphanies of my life, and I've been pursuing it ever since. It's sort of and because we were third generation rock and roll, the Beatles were second generation.
Yeah,
we were able to accept it as a lifestyle. It wasn't a show business thing, really, for us. It was really a matter of it was just life.
Yeah.
The movie Help, was sort of how we looked at it.
Yeah.
you came off stage and you went and the four guys went into their apartment doors and it was all the same room,
Yeah, I've always wanted to live there.
You live together, you played, made this wonderful music, but you do it together,
Right.
as a group, and that was something that was just attractive to me, who knows.
I always thought that's what Bruce was singing about in No Surrender.
I don't always pay attention to the words, but what do you think for a minute?
Have you not played it enough times, Steve?
Oh yeah, we learn more in school than learn more from a record and all that than in school. Yeah, it was about growing up, and it was our source of information. We learned about everything. We learned about politics. Eventually, we learned about Eastern religion. My librarian at the school was a very hip lady. And I was talking to her about Bob Dylan, and she said, "Well, if you like Bob Dylan, you should read this," and gave me Allen Ginsberg. And Allen Ginsberg was the first Buddhist we'd ever heard of.
Yeah, nice.
So that whole introduction of Eastern religion began there, and then George Harrison, of course, would introduce that to us, and it was so impactful. I mean, we didn't have information like people have now.
No.
There was no information, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
It was only what you heard from your friends or your parents, or TV wasn't giving you too much, really.
No.
I'm trying to think. Then we just didn't. We didn't have that sort of world view. I think the whole concept of a global world was introduced to us by the Beatles.
Definitely. I mean, that was definitely true for me. I mean, I grew up in the UK equivalent of Project. It was very rough. No well view at all. But by the time I was 10, I was going down the music library and hiring out Ravi Shankar albums and things like that. I married a Bengali woman, which where I grew up, people didn't marry Asian women. I mean, they might beat them up occasionally, but not marry them.
Well, yeah.
Well, it's underestimated their role as teachers, I think.
No question. I mean, they didn't know it. I mean, they weren't necessarily aware of it. They were just doing their thing, and happened to be doing it in public. Under public scrutiny, which they had no choice about at that point, really. But they were doing mostly good things. I mean, even the drug thing, which it's easy for people to sort of look down on now and criticize.
Yeah, for sure.
But when I explain to people, they don't really believe me. But because of the Beatles, we did drugs to learn, to become enlightened. We did not take drugs to escape. And I'm really serious about that. Nobody did heroin. That was absolutely not cool. That's beyond all comprehension. But it wasn't cool back then. Speed was not cool. We didn't know the Beatles were doing it in Hamburg yet,
Yeah. Yeah. That history is
and Bob Dylan.
Yeah. That history's later.
Right,
Comes out later.
100 songs a night because of it. But we didn't know that either. But on the street, speed was known as there was an expression, speed kills. But the psychedelics, the marijuana or hashish or LSD was strictly all about enlightenment. Get me more information. How do I become enlightened? The way the Beatles seem to be.
I'll take your word for it.
And then they quickly went from that to the meditation thing, and then that caught on as well.
Yeah.
Which was a nice sort of way of replacing the drugs. Actually, all that happened. People don't remember, but things were happening very quickly in those days. Very quickly. I mean, massive, profound changes would happen every 3 months. And now nothing happens. 5 years goes by and nothing happens. In 5 years, the Beatles went from Twist and Shout to Sgt. Pepper. Yeah. Now it's the normal spacing between albums, and the albums you do are pretty much the same as the last one. So the drug thing, which we became aware of in the suburbs anyway, we were about a year behind the cities in New Jersey. 67 probably. By 68, they were into meditation, and then drug thing was over. It lasted 6 months or a year.
Well, George, of course, went to Haight-Ashbury and, saw everyone off their face on LSD and compared it to the Bowery, and I think he felt responsible, for that thing.
Yeah, and he was and wasn't. I mean, the Beatles can blame themselves a little bit for those casualties, but at the same time, then they must take credit for all the good stuff they've done. It's a journey to find. It's a bit of an adventure to seek out the truth, or to seek out enlightenment, to seek out knowledge or wisdom. It's a perilous journey sometimes, and there's going to be casualties. Have to be weighed against the 100 million that have been inspired somewhere or touched by the Beatles' positive work.
It's amazing to hear someone who was out in America and conscious of seeing the Beatles and Ed Sullivan, seeing them arrive in America, and then that's the impetus for him starting one of the greatest rock bands ever with his best mate.
Yeah. Well, it's much mythologized, isn't it? But it's right there from the horse's mouth, And do you know the little detail that I loved was all the accordion players having to go get Farfisa organs, get a jump ahead. Like, oh, God damn it. I tried to say, but you probably noticed that Steve, that it was pre-Vox Continental. So, if you want one, you had to have a Farfisa. But absolutely fascinating. And I think this is something I've thought about many times. We've talked about it in a previous episode, but if you look at the haircuts, Steve mentioned it too, the clothes that people are wearing, and then compare it to just 5 years later. So the California of 1969, for example, absolutely zero resemblance to. You see those shots of the Beatles audiences, and it's like young men with really square. They look like they've just left the Marines, right? And they're trying to enjoy themselves, but they look so square.
And sort of the idea you're going out for concert, so you dress up, and that's what you do.
Those kids were losing their minds then, and I think that they were ripe for that, because everything was. Steve says it looked for all the faults in society, and he correctly identifies what they were. On a civil rights front, on a feminist front, things were not great, terrible, and they needed improving. And the 60s are about moving that journey forward. But actually, what it was basically ticking along. Everyone was in lockstep with that. It was this is how it is, right? And then the Beatles are literally, as he says, spaceship landing in Hyde Park.
Amazing. And sort of providing that opportunity to make the next step as well, I think.
Obviously it really impacted Steve's life, and it's funny, isn't it? And he's worked with the Beatles a few times since and everything, and sometimes even just working with the Beatles can be can impact your life. It's impacted mine. We'll save that. We'll talk about that another time, but this week's special guest, we have a film every week with someone who isn't, Steve Van Zandt.
Yeah, Summer Litchfield, who is the daughter of David Litchfield, who worked with Paul, particularly sort of Wings era. One Hand Clapping, which is this live film which David produced and actually did the artwork for. And I think he even came up with a phrase. I think between Paul and him, there's a bit of a debate about that. But fascinating character. He's kind of trained as a designer. He worked with famously did a magazine called Ritz magazine. Which was kind of did that with David Bailey, and they're very good friends with him. But it's kind of someone who, it's amazing. Summer's she's quite sort of modest about, doesn't sort of name drop and stuff, and then she's like, oh yeah, Paul used to pop around the house and stuff, and suddenly sort of she's sort of, it's almost like she's sort of aware of it, how amazing that was at the time, and I guess when you're younger, it's just kind of I guess even at that age, it's not that normal, but she sort of took it for granted, and fascinating character. Sadly, he passed away quite recently, and I think it's really good for her to kind of talk about the sort of fond memories she had with her dad. Yeah, amazing character, amazing guy.
Well, let's see that then. Summer Litchfield.
I guess we'll kick off with the question we ask everybody is, can you imagine what your life would have been like without the Beatles? For you, I think your story is quite intimately linked with your father's story, isn't it? Because he had a lot of connection with, not just with the Beatles and Paul McCartney, but with lots of people from that era.
Yeah, he did. I mean, I would say that, and not just for this podcast, the friendship that my dad had with Paul was one of the most significant ones that he had with anyone, really. They were introduced by Linda. Dad had a magazine called The Image, which was, that he started in I think at the end of the 60s. So when Paul called Dad and said, do you want to come and work with me and make this film? Firstly, Dad had always wanted to work, more in film, probably more so in film than magazines and publishing. I think he had just done a film with Steven Berkoff. And so when Linda suggested the idea to Paul that Dad might be a good person to speak to, I think Dad jumped at the chance.
So you mentioned Jeff Britton a few times, who was the drummer in Wings, and must have been it's interesting you talking about how Paul McCartney used the film almost to check out the dynamic of the band, because looking at from an outsider's point of view, it feels like, the shackles were off and he was having fun. But I imagine for the rest of the band, that was a huge amount of pressure, having to come in and sit in to be the new Ringo Starr.
He wanted to see how the group were working together. It wasn't necessarily originally that he wanted to make this sort of huge film. He more wanted it to see what the dynamic was like between everyone in the band.
That's interesting. We should say, so that ended up being one hand clapping, which became quite legendary because it never really got released. I remember seeing it on YouTube. You used to be able to watch individual sort of 5-minute bursts on YouTube and piece it all together, but it's finally got a release, hasn't it, now?
Yeah, which was really poignant because just before my dad died a couple of years ago, he reached out to a few people that he wanted to speak to before he went. And Paul was one of the people, he hadn't spoken to him for a good 20 years, I think. And he reached out to Paul and spoke to his PA, and Paul was in a car going to an event and called Dad back, and they were on the phone for half an hour laughing away as if it had been, yesterday that they last spoke. And then, a year and a half later, I heard that One Hand Clapping was going to be, the film was going to be remastered. The album, which had the artwork for the cover, was Dad's design. Yeah. And I think Dad came up with the name One Hand Clapping.
He does strike me as being one of those people. He has a kind of small circle of very close friends, and he's very loyal to those people. And there's lots of little anecdotal stories here about him remembering little incidents and sending notes, being, I remember that time. And he spoke to one of the cameramen who works on the Let It Be film, saying, remember that time we went for a curry when we finished filming? And this guy was like, how do you even remember that? And he sent little, when they came out and sent the box set and everything.
No, I think he genuinely has always been someone that is pretty down to earth, even though it's a cliche. I was 3 years old when Dad and Paul were working together, but he'd turn up at our flat in Kilburn on a motorbike and no entourage, and just check if anyone needed anything from the shops, because he'd go down and get some ice creams if anyone wanted anything, some chocolate. Linda they also had a Rolls Royce at the time, I think, and Linda would Mum always says she remembers when she was sort of struggling with some shopping. Linda drove past in the Rolls Royce and said, Helen, do you need a lift? And I think our neighbours came down once and just knocked on the door asking for a cup of sugar or something, and Paul opened the door, or something ridiculous like that.
So it's funny, because I know you're not like a massive Beatles fan, really. You're not a kind of obsessive like Best Niall. But it's still been a huge part of your life, hasn't it? And it must be quite weird with it. Almost like by default you've ended up having this life which would have been very different were it not for, certainly for Paul McCartney.
I was carried around a party by Elton John when I was 5. And I'd meet all sorts of people. I mean, I actually think when I was about 12, meeting George Michael was the most exciting thing. You could keep your Paul McCartneys and your Elton Johns. It was more about meeting George Michael. But I think because for my dad, his friendship with Paul and his working partnership came at a time where I think he nearly lost everything, really. And it helped to propel him onto working on magazines or founding a magazine, his second magazine.
Tell us more about this book.
Well, it's really, it would be the story of my dad's days on magazines when he was an editor that sort of overlapped with me working on magazines. So we both became writers, editors. So I grew up in those magazine offices. So I suppose blown away is the wrong term. I just felt comfortable in publishing and in magazine publishings. But my life, because I so looked up to my dad, if Dad hadn't had the friendship that he'd had with Paul, and if there hadn't been the Beatles, then I wouldn't have been, working in magazines like my dad did, and we wouldn't have had the same lives, for sure.
One Hand Clapping, I think it's probably my favourite post-Beatles era for Paul, particularly I think his voice has never been better. It's so amazing.
Well, 69, 73 is incredible, isn't it? Yeah, it's incredible. People who are dismissive of Paul's vocals, now, I'm a musician, I play piano and guitar, and I try and sing badly. They just haven't tried to sing his parts. That's all I can say. So next time you feel like dissing Paul McCartney, go and sing Golden Slumbers. You'll be able to sing that first bit, but have a go at the second bit.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a ballad, by the way. So, all right, go and try and sing Live and Let Die. Well, you've got to sound like Paul, not just karaoke it.
Yeah.
Do it. Get that throat rip in. Do that. Get those tonal differences in. He's literally to me, that I've never had anyone with that. And thank God there are vocal coaches who agree with me, so it's not just me. I've never had anyone with such a diverse voice. It certainly wasn't John. Certainly not Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder's a brilliant vocalist. George Michael's a brilliant vocalist. But there's not a lot of diversity in their sounds.
Yeah.
Because Paul has the many voices of,
Yeah.
try and recreate it.
Yeah, try and do that and then do Maybe I'm Amazed at the end and see if you can hit the top notes in that.
Yeah. I don't even think Paul can anymore. But, at least he's got an excuse of being in his 80s.
Exactly.
But you are talking about 69, 74. Anyway, Steve Van Zandt, huge fan and everything. Out of the positivity of some of that you were just talking about with Summer, I think that the second half of Steve's interview, I found slightly depressing because he's talking about, not in a bad way, but what he's talking about is the reduction in quality that he's seen and the reduction in opportunities. And he makes this point, well, I'll let him make it, but basically he's talking about the scale on which projects are done these days and what that means for quality. So I think that we'll discuss it afterwards. So Steve Van Zandt, part 2.
The musical plans and creative plans have been mostly put aside these last 10 years. I quit producing in the mid-90s because I came to the realization, the tragic realization, that there's no reason to make a record anymore. There's no reason to try and achieve greatness in any way. There's no place for greatness in our culture. How we got there is incredible, okay? But we got there. But certainly there's no reason to make a rock and roll record when no radio station can play it and no record company can sign it. And so I said, you know what, I got to put this aside for a minute. Even though I'm on this planet, I am quite sure, if I'm here for any reason, is to be creative and write songs and to produce records and to arrange records, which I love doing, and to write movies and make movies and be creative. And all that has to stop because there's no reason to do it right now. There's no infrastructure to support it. So let's try and create a new infrastructure to then support the quest for greatness and the communication of greatness and how to achieve it and the craft of it. So started the radio show for that reason. I said the first step has to be we have got to get the standards back up. We can't have kids listening to the radio and thinking that's okay. And that's as good as it gets. And all I have to do is achieve that level of mediocrity, and then I will too be a celebrity and a success. although you certainly can be a celebrity and a success from achieving a certain level of mediocrity. It's not helping our culture. Okay, I'm sorry. I know you end up sounding like your own father as we grow up, but our fathers were wrong, okay, about rock and roll, and I'm right about this, okay, because no one is inventing anything new. The Renaissance is still resonating through all this mediocrity. It just happens to be the lowest form of it, when they invent new instruments, yes, maybe they can make a case that finally the Renaissance of the 50s and 60s is irrelevant, But we're hundreds of years away from that, I think. Well, I am proud of the radio show. I'm very proud to play the best new rock and roll that exists on the planet because there's no other format that does it, unfortunately. I'm very proud to have the other 2/3 of my program reflect all 60 years of rock and roll, so people get a chance to connect the dots and hear the context.
Yeah.
And you hear the influence of Buddy Holly and the Crickets and Johnny Burnett and the Rock and Roll Trio and the Ramones and the Clash and the Kinks and the Hollies and Yardbirds and the Shirelles and Chiffons and Dick Dale and actually hear that stuff and have access to that stuff, so that they can be nurtured by it and inspired by it and maybe even combine a few things and create something new from it.
So I agree with everything you've just said, and a lot of the things you said do relate to the UK too. I found it really strange at school, which was that if you, in class, they would give you music classes, they would give you the violin to learn. But that's a very hard instrument to learn, and they do it not knowing whether you have any aptitude. If they started everyone with a guitar, they would quickly find out who's musical. 3 chords, the ones who aren't musical would still be able to make songs and strum along to a few things. But then you could put them onto violins and things like that. But there seems to be absolutely no understanding of how beneficial it is to learn an instrument. Apart from the commitment, it's what it does to your brain. Well, and also what it does to your sense of community.
I know. But I mean, any kind of music class, ironically, statistics show improve kids' ability to learn math and science. So that's sort of being ignored as well. But we are concentrating on the other statistic right now, which is just appalling, and people don't believe it when I say it. But we have a dropout epidemic of 1 out of 3 in high school. 1 out of 3. All right. And we know now that if a kid likes one single class or one single teacher, they'll come to school. We can make it fun. We have the common ground. Every kid has an iPod, with a thing in their ear, right? They're listening to something. Well, all we have to do is say, what are you listening to? Let's trace it back. Let's see what you're listening to right now. Let's have some fun and follow the journey. Where did that come from? And we'll trace, whatever it is, Jay-Z, back to Son House. In 40 easy steps, whatever, and that is doable. That's doable. I mean, I like to do to spend my time on attainable goals. What is songwriting? What is a manager? What do they do? What's a producer do? What's an arranger do? Arrangers are the great lost sort of craft. What do they do? Where do they go? This whole DIY thing that we have. It's not that we've sort of these past 2 generations have somehow evolved into this DIY. We've abandoned them. They've been forced to go into DIY, do-it-yourself sort of thinking. Well, now we have the evidence that DIY doesn't work. Okay? All it produces is more mediocrity because it has to. Great records are made by an army of people. I mean, the best records ever made, you had singers and musicians and songwriters and arrangers and producers and this and that and engineers and all coming together for that 2.5 minutes and
Yeah.
creating this magic.
Yeah, I
You
agree.
can't do all those jobs. Yeah. I mean, who needs that? Living that isolated sort of existence. But we're encouraging that isolated existence with all this digital thing.
I have a band called the Ghost Orchestra, and if we're all playing, and we don't play very many gigs because we can't afford to, but if we did, there's 14 of us, and it's a great pain to me in my heart that I never got to take the 14 people to Abbey Road and have George Martin produce and arrange and with me and Jeff Emmerich engineer it. But you have to do what you have to do.
Nothing wrong with learning how to do all those things, learning something about them. That's okay. I mean, and I'm sure you improve by doing that. But there's something about the interaction of people, and to some extent, the compromises even. I don't look at it too often as compromises, because usually it's not exactly compromises. It's actually usually, hopefully, deciding on the right course of action, between two opinions or three opinions, and something gets decided. Hopefully, it's not in a compromise in the sense of diluting the idea. It can be a compromise in the sense of just improving the idea, so it's more of a dialectic than a compromise. It's more of and that's how I see things. And you see things as a group, sort of all working towards the same end. Let's make the greatest record ever made today. Whoever wants to chip in here with ideas, you're more than welcome, because our purpose is greatness, not ego gratification. And I tell you the truth, after you achieve greatness, you're going to have the ego gratification anyway, no matter who had the idea for the title or the chorus or the bridge, or it doesn't matter whose idea it was. You can own that greatness. You can own that wonderful work you just created. Everyone has a right to it. So why not go for that? And get the reward from that, rather than the much lesser reward of doing it all yourself and creating something that's not very good.
Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it, with the Beatles? I mean, it's been a long time, 40, 50 years. And people know more about them than their own family. And, they just do, don't they, right? They know more about the Beatles than their own family, yeah. But what's happened to me, what I think is really interesting, is that we've seen how as solo artists, they didn't quite match what they did as a group. We've lived through all the bad stuff. We've seen the personal accounts of how, maybe they weren't all such nice people sometimes, all that kind of stuff. And yet, what's really fascinating to me is it's 50 years later, 60 years even since Love Me Do, the myth is still intact. Well, how is that,
Well, that's very simple. It's not a myth. It's the Beatles. The way to keep your, not myth intact, but legitimate legend intact, is to die young. Be great and die young. Well, the Beatles lasted 8 years, right? 13 albums, whatever it was. And so all the stuff you're talking about that may be questionable in terms of diluting the legend or the myth were post-Beatles. Okay, it wasn't the Beatles that, let it be, whatever, but even Let It Be has some amazing moments in it. Yeah. So maybe it was so questionable in their own minds that they actually got back together to do Abbey Road, right? I mean, they didn't want to go out with that one, and you don't blame them. But the fact is, virtually everything they did was great. So that's how the myth stays intact. It wasn't diluted. It wasn't. They didn't grow old and gradually mediocre. I guess I was the first one to say that the Rolling Stones needed the Beatles to set their standards. and in my opinion, haven't made a great record since the Beatles broke up. Exile for me was their last great record. You know, but the longevity of continuing to be out there, bringing their music to generation after generation, I think has many, many pluses and is a really good thing, actually. The whatever it's been, 20 or 30 albums since Exile that are not, don't particularly communicate much to me is irrelevant. They've done more than enough for me. They don't owe me anything. Their first 12 albums, whatever it is just is enough for a lifetime. So you get so in their case, then the artistic sort of purity gets diluted by 12 amazing albums of the 35. A third of their work is going to be considered great, as opposed to the Beatles, virtually 100% or 90%, considered great. So the artistic sort of legend is going to stay much more intact with the Beatles. But you gain other things by them being around, and thank goodness Paul and Ringo are still touring, because it fulfills the same function, especially these last 5-6 years, where Paul's embracing the Beatles a bit more, which is how it should be. I prefer more, of course, but at least half is communicating to these next generations what that stuff was.
Well, I've seen Paul live a few times. You're right. He's amazing live. The people who didn't like Paul's solo stuff also, I don't want to go and see him live. He's going to do the frog song. And it's like, you must have seen enough clips by now to know that he's mostly doing Beatles stuff, and he'll be doing stuff like Helter Skelter as well as, Michelle, right? But the thing I'm always conscious of now is that I don't want it to happen, but sometime even if you said 20 years, and they all live to be 100, we've only got 20 years left. And the story is coming to a close. And I think that adds a lot of emotion to those shows.
As there should be. But it's also his, for many, many years, he didn't do much Beatles stuff. So there's that combination of him really feeling quite comfortable, of course, totally legitimately so. It's his stuff. Well, I don't care if John wrote it or George wrote it. They were absolutely integrated and influenced each other, in a way that is totally legitimate for him to embrace that stuff. So he's embracing it, and so the audience is embracing it, and I think that love affair has never been stronger than now, and so glad that he's doing that, because he deserves the accolades and the multi-generational gratitude, that he's now getting for real, because he's embracing his best work. Why disregard your best work? Because you did it with a few other guys? That's not a good lesson to teach kids, okay? Let's teach them properly that you're equally proud of the stuff you did in collaboration, because that collaboration that I think matters. It matters most, because you are working together with others to create something great. That lesson, regardless of what it was that was created, whether it's to your taste or not, doesn't matter. It's the fact that this collaboration took place and greatness came from it. That is something we should all take into our lives, whether musically or not, right?
Can we be specific? When you think of your own career, what is that Beatles influence? What can you directly attribute to them? How many members of the E Street Band would have been playing with you? What's the direct influence?
No, there would have been no bands. I don't believe. I mean, I don't know who would have. When you think about the '60s, maybe the Rascals might have, although I know they were influenced by the Beatles as well, but maybe somebody like the Rascals would have formed anyway, because they're so soulful and so connected to black soul and R&B as white guys, that they actually very legitimately may have formed a band, but just as likely they may have been Felix and Eddie. They may have been the two lead singers. The Righteous Brothers. Or, it may not have been the Rascals. Because it was the Beatles that made the drummer important. I mean, one thing I didn't mention when I said that first impression of the Beatles, what was most important was the fact that all four of them were somehow equals. This was weird, man. Okay, this was not, and believe me, George Martin, the producer, Brian Epstein, the manager, the record company, all questioned this and said, who's going to be the leader? Who is going to be John Lennon and the Beatles, or Paul McCartney and the Beatles, or who's going to be the guy? And luckily for the world, they decided to make it equal, even though Paul and John were singing most of the songs, and were obviously the stars, obvious stars, obviously.
I guess, yeah.
But yet, when you saw them, Ringo, was somehow equally important. He really was. George Harrison was the guy I liked the most. Yeah, I play guitar, but, so did John Lennon, right? But somehow I like George Harrison. I like his harmony with Paul, greatly underrated. Fantastic harmony. If you listen to what they're singing, great guitar player, obviously. But for the first time, a sort of sideman in the form of a guitar player, or sideman in the form of a drummer, were equally important. That's the biggest difference between pre-Beatles and post, So after that, you knew the Rolling Stones' names. And believe me, even the bands of the British Invasion, whose bands you don't know the names of, consequently weren't as big. And
well, what's the impact? Could the E Street Band without the Beatles have happened, do you think?
No. I mean, I don't think so. Keep in mind, rock and roll was not pop music. It became pop music. It was a coup d'etat. Okay? It was a cult of freaks. And people thought that Elvis Presley was black because of his voice. They thought he was singing in a primitive manner. It's impossible to sort of comprehend that now. He sounds like like an opera singer, compared to, his beautiful melodic voice was like utterly primitive and scary for people back then. I don't know. I don't get it. But so now here come the Beatles, and because their voices are so good, certainly looking back, so commercial, but in the context of the time, still somehow primitive and bluesy and blackish. Paul did a fantastic Little Richard impersonation, and John was great with Arthur Alexander or whoever. So the influence of the black singers on these white guys was quite obvious back then for people, and scary, and so, but yet they overcame that and became hits, right?
Yeah, of course.
But what they did then was open the door, because once Mick Jagger got in the door, I think really was a big moment, and we talked about it before, how they're writing the Stones' second single, the Beatles writing the Stones' second single, caused radio to have to play it, and once Mick Jagger's voice was accepted at radio, that was a whole breakthrough, because now you could accept, Eric Burden more easily, Roger Daltrey more easily, Ray Davies more easily, and certainly Bob Dylan more easily. So all of a sudden, the concept of great singing and having a great voice became two separate things. That was not two separate things up until then. You had to have a great voice to be a great singer, whatever, that sweet melodic thing, however you define it, right? Well, for the first time, you could be a great singer, but not have that natural gift of a great voice. Well, Bob Dylan's one of the greatest singers of all time. He's a fantastic singer, okay? And it was because he was a great singer and a great sense of melody was how he eventually sold those lyrics. People think he's famous because of his lyrics. He's not famous because of his lyrics. He's infamous because of his lyrics. He didn't get famous or popular because of his lyrics. He became famous and popular because he was a great singer. And fantastic chord changes, great melodies. That's the art form we work in. Lyrics are always going to be icing on the cake. I don't care what critics may think. Okay? There certainly would not have been a Bruce Springsteen had there not been Mick Jagger or Bob Dylan or Eric Burden, Paul Jones, Steve Marriott. You know what I mean? They're just, you can't imagine, singers back then were, there was Steve Lawrence, it was Sinatra, it was Dean Martin, it was, Bobby Darin,
Well,
So-
we need to wrap up. So, final question that I ask everyone. I mean, can you imagine your life without the Beatles? And what's that one thing that they gave you? Or what would you have been doing without the Beatles?
I don't know where I'd be. I mean, I don't know that I would have gone into music. Probably not. I didn't fit in anywhere else, though. So it was a really important for me. There was a few of us that really had no other choice. I've talked about this before, but everybody had a band, but as soon as someone had a choice to do something else, they took it because it was not a legitimate business until the 70s. No sort of regular income or revenue or there was no such thing, really. So you were one step away from being a criminal by playing rock and roll in the 60s. And so, only a few of us were left standing. And the reason we were left standing was because we had no other choice. There was nothing else. I didn't have any interest in any legitimate sort of career or any mode of education. I mean, there's no interest whatsoever. And I was lost as a 13-year-old. Looking ahead at the time, I was like, my father's like, get ready for college or, get into construction work with me or whatever, all the choices that you're looking at. And I was like, uh-oh, I don't want to do any of these things. What does that make me? Well, I'm a freak. Now what? Well, here come the Beatles saying, look at this new world. Yeah, you're a freak, but so are we. We have a whole world of freaks. We have a world for freaks like you, And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Lucky
of course,
me.
yes, and you obviously go on to act and DJ and everything else. And I guess what you're saying is, that none of that could have
Music.
happened, would have happened, without the Beatles.
Oh, everything. I owe the Beatles everything. I mean, more so for me, I think, than most people. I didn't have any other thing I wanted to do, period. I mean, I don't know, it's hard to sort of maybe relate to that. But when you look around the world and there's no place for you, none. I'm not going to rule out the possibility of I'll be one of those people who committed suicide. Yeah. Who knows? If you don't have any place to go or any hope or any reason to live, maybe you choose not to live. Yeah. So I wouldn't rule that out. I could have been a soprano for real, been behind bars or dead. Easy way out, right? You got nothing else to do. Become a criminal. At least it's a legit job. I don't know. But for me, I just there's no way to imagine where I'd be without them.
I think a really good point that he made in that was that idea of you need a team. If you're working in isolation, you don't have someone egging you on, you don't have that sort of sense of quality control. And, there's amazing loads of genius solo artists, but sometimes you need somebody to be a sounding board.
Well, I think there's what he's talking about is that diversity that was available. So great studios, each with their own acoustic and engineers and equipment, often homemade equipment, that they were using. Great engineers, great producers, great arrangers, great horn players, great string sections, great individual writers and whatever, and a massive team to achieve greatness. Whereas most of us, including myself, are making music these days out of home studios or small studios like this one that we're in, which is a beautiful studio. But it'll be the 2 or 3 musicians and one guy behind a desk on a laptop, and we're all using the same plugins. I was in McCartney's studio once, right, down in Rye, and he's got a big desk. And he's got the Beatles Fairchild compressors into the wall, and I'm like, literally, oh, holy grail, Fairchilds. These are really expensive machines if you can ever find one now. And he's got all that stuff, but basically, when it comes down to it, he was running Logic just like me, and that meant he had the same internal plugins. His engineer was using, and yeah, I'm sure they get freebies from all the new plugin companies, but essentially, we're all using the same tools, whereas if you were recording in the 60s or 70s in Abbey Road Studio 2, or you were in Columbia in New York, these are very different sounds. And the cognoscenti, the kind of people who can work out what wine you're drinking, can listen to a song and go Studio 2, just from the reverb. And so they had these big teams, and now we don't have it. And it's a tragedy, it is.
There's that great Lenny Kravitz quote where he's going like, but this console's got the 60s dust in it. That's kind of what you're after.
That said, Ian Brodie from the Lightning Seeds, who I interviewed for this series, and I said to him about, the magic of Studio 2. He goes, no, it's just a studio.
Really?
And I was going, that's not true. He goes, it is a studio. I was going, it's not. Every time I go in there, all the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. And if you're a musician, you play better when you're in there. It's like, oh my God, Kate Bush did the kick inside here. Oh my God, Radiohead did OK Computer here. Of course you play better. You want to be part of the pantheon. Not just go, oh, I'm a tourist. Oh look, nice, I'm a tinkle. You go, right, I'm going to do my best ever performance. So I get that. So it's not true. I think that the spaces are important too.
Yeah, it's almost like there's competition even when the competition aren't around anymore, or but it's just that I need to match this.
You're a writer. You haven't. Who do you have in mind when you're writing? Of course there are people you go, I want to be as good as Hemingway.
Yeah, exactly. Probably not. I like sort of simplicity of Hemingway. Something I was taught really early on was just like take all the superfluous words out. And I think someone like Ezra Pound is like I'm really fascinated by. I'm interested because he was like an amazing editor, and he would just take all. There's a really famous book when he goes around through T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and he's just basically page and page crossing out. Don't need this. And he literally writes BS in it. That's my thing. Is like, you don't need superfluous, adjectives to describe it. Something's amazing. You don't have to say it's amazing every time.
You should never do.
Even though I say it all the time on this podcast.
Well, that's true, but that's extemporizing. So, but Mark Twain said, if you see an adverb, kill it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
He was absolutely right.
Yes, he was.
I had to think about that for a second. I'm not, it's not exactly, I'm not exactly doing my best Peter Cook impression here, is it? Sorry, I couldn't think of a quick adverb. Kill me. Look, it's been great to hear Steve talk and everything. And we're wrapping up the first season here with this. We have one last episode to go. And it's
surprise.
It is a surprise. We're not going to tell you what it is yet. One of the reasons is there's some legal difficulties to sort out. But if I could sort out those legal difficulties, we'll bring you something you definitely haven't heard before. We should do it in the spirit of the Christmas fan club record.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
they're completely bonkers, aren't they? So we should do it like that.
And
hopefully we'll get a few people together. Get them in here. Do you think we could persuade a few people?
I think, we'll get a few
little
guest appearances. Could be good. Yeah, definitely.
We'll see what we can do.
Maybe in disguise.
Yeah. So if you get a chance, subscribe, because season 2 is happening. We've already done the interviews. Like I say, there'll be some really good people from Michael Palin and Nancy Sinatra and David Attenborough and a few other people. That's coming back in the new year. We'll be here on the 1st of January, but there'll be the Christmas episode. I'm going to schedule it for the time of the King's speech
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's when it'll be scheduled on Spotify. You've either got the choice of Charles banging on about whatever he's banging on about this year, or you can listen to Without the Beatles and have a bit of a laugh. There you go, and to see how our ratings compare. I'm pretty certain we could knock them into a cocked crown.
We'll be on the World Service, I'm sure.
Yeah. See you then.